A factory in Shanghai is sending light through a chip package, not a simulation, not a roadmap slide. Physical hardware on a bench in Shanghai's Lingang base, and light is literally moving inside it. The accepted rule of AI hardware interconnect says the only teams close to doing that in a form factories can actually scale are TSMC and Broadcom. China just posted its split. Before you file this under another lab demo, the distinction matters. A sample is not a press release. It is hardware that works once. And that is exactly how every production technology in history has started. The question is never whether the physics works. The question is whether you can make 1,000 of them, then 1,000,000 all at spec, with consistent yield. That question is still open, but the physics question has an answer now, and the answer came out of Shanghai. Here is why that matters beyond one company's bench result. The bandwidth bottleneck between chips is the next constraint on artificial intelligence scaling. Bigger than memory, bigger than how many compute nodes you can stack in a rack. The gap between chips, the link that lets one accelerator talk to the next, is where the next wall lives, and the entire hyperscale industry has converged on one specific answer: co-packaged optics. The company, or the country, that industrializes it first sets the price, the form factor, and the supply terms for every frontier artificial intelligence cluster built through the 2030s. That is the prize. And right now, there are two very different positions in the race: a manufacturing ramp being built by the leaders, and a working sample being held by a challenger. By the end of this, you will understand what co-packaged optics actually is, how China got a working sample without the tooling most analysts assume was the entry ticket, and exactly where the gap to volume production still lives, and why that gap is harder to close than the physics. This is not really a story about one lab result. It is a story about which side reaches the manufacturing floor first on the technology that replaces copper at the chip edge, and what it means for artificial intelligence hardware supplies chains when they do. To understand the stakes, you need to understand what copper is actually costing artificial intelligence hardware right now. In current cluster designs, the compute dies and the optical transceivers that move data off-chip are separate components. Data leaves the processor, travels across a copper path to an external optical module, converts from an electrical signal to light, and goes out over fiber. That copper gap, even measured in centimeters, is a power tax, a latency penalty, and a bandwidth ceiling. At the data rates modern artificial intelligence clusters demand, moving the equivalent of thousands of high-definition video streams between chips every second, a few centimeters of copper is not a packaging detail. It is a structural bottleneck. Think of current artificial intelligence clusters like a city where every building runs its own telephone exchange in the lobby. Data leaves the chip, walks down the hall to the exchange room, converts formats, and then goes out. Co-packaged optics is the decision to move the exchange inside the walls, right at the chip edge, not a cable length away. The optical engine sits flush against the compute die. Light carries the signal the moment it leaves the processor. You cut the copper gap, cut the conversion loss, and cut the power draw, all in one move. TSMC and Broadcom are building toward exactly this, jointly developing co-packaged optics integration as the architecture for the next generation of hyperscale artificial intelligence infrastructure. They are the pace setters. They have set their split time. The question the industry has been asking is, who else can even get in the race? The answer, at the sample stage, turns out to include a company out of Shanghai's Lingang base. This is not a chip startup. It is an established image sensor packaging house with a heritage in precision, optical electrical integration at the die edge. Image sensor work demands exactly the kind of tight coupling between optical and electrical layers that co-packaged optics requires, which makes the move less of a leap than it might first appear. The skills transfer, not perfectly, but this organization is not starting from zero. What they have produced is physical silicon photonics co-packaged optics samples, not a white paper, not a simulation result, hardware. Light is moving inside a chip package built in Lingang, and that is the first split posted by the Chinese side of this race. The question that result immediately raises is the one the split does not answer. How did they get there without the process tooling the West assumed was the barrier? The answer is in the choice of process. Silicon photonics is the specific pathway, and silicon photonics does not require the leading-edge lithography that defines the frontier of chip manufacturing. To understand why, you need to understand what the optical engine actually does. It integrates waveguides, modulators, and photodetectors onto silicon, components that guide and manipulate light rather than switch electrons. The physics of light does not demand the smallest possible transistor features. What it demands is precise geometry in the waveguide structures that channel the light. And that geometry is achievable on mature fabrication processes, nodes that are orders of magnitude less advanced than what TSMC uses for its leading-edge logic chips. Building a silicon photonics optical engine is less like carving a transistor, where you are etching features smaller than a virus, requiring equipment that costs hundreds of millions per unit and is controlled by a handful of companies globally, and more like cutting a precise channel in glass. The geometry has to be exact, but you do not need the world's sharpest blade to do it. Mature node fabs, which China has access to, can achieve the waveguide precision a working silicon photonics optical engine requires. That is the specific pathway that makes a working co-packaged optics sample accessible without frontier lithography access, which immediately raises the viewer's natural follow-up. If mature nodes are sufficient, why isn't everyone doing this already? The answer is that a working sample and a manufacturable product are entirely different engineering problems. The optical engine is one layer. Co-packaged optics is the integration of that optical engine with a compute die inside a single package at production yield across thousands of operating hours under real thermal conditions. Silicon and photonic materials expand at different rates when they heat up. Bonding them reliably, without introducing defects at the interface, without degrading optical alignment over time, is a materials and process engineering challenge that a working sample does not resolve. That is where the split reopens. Zoom out for a moment to the strategic landscape, because the prize here is not abstract. The hyperscale artificial intelligence interconnect roadmap has not left co-packaged optics as one option among several. It has converged on it. As artificial intelligence models grow, more parameters, more layers, more communication between accelerators, the bottleneck migrates. First it was raw compute, then memory bandwidth. Now it is the interconnect, the physical link between chips as data moves across a cluster of thousands of accelerators running in coordination. You can build a bigger engine and a bigger fuel tank, but if the fuel line cannot keep up, the system chokes. Co-packaged optics is the industry's committed answer, a wider line, made of light instead of copper. Can you just use more copper lanes or existing external optical modules? The industry has been doing that for years, and the limits are now visible. More copper lanes at artificial intelligence cluster data rates means more power consumption, more heat, more circuitry, and higher cost per bit of bandwidth. External optical modules help, but the copper gap they still require has not disappeared. Co-packaged optics is not a linear upgrade on what exists. It is a structural step change, and the hyperscale roadmap has committed to it precisely because the alternatives are running out of room. So, the prize is defined, the roadmap is committed. TSMC and Broadcom are building the ramp, and China has a sample. Now, let's be precise about what that sample can and cannot prove, because this is where the shape of the race gets clear. A sample proves that the physics works. It does not prove yield, the fraction of parts that come off the line functioning correctly. It does not prove thermal stability across thousands of hours of operation in a real data center environment. It does not prove that the process of co-bonding an optical layer to a compute die can be executed at volume without introducing defects at a rate that makes production economically unworkable. And critically, it does not prove the one thing that may be the deepest part of the gap, the co-development ecosystem. TSMC and Broadcom have not just been building a better optical engine in a lab. They have been co-developing co-packaged optics integration with hyperscale customers who are simultaneously designing the compute dies that will sit inside the same package. The optical engine and the compute die are not independent designs that get bolted together at the end. They are co-designed, with the thermal profile of one informing the layout of the other, with the package architecture evolving through joint iteration cycles that take years. A new entrant does not just need better tooling, It needs a customer who is willing to co-design from scratch while the target keeps moving. Think of it this way. Making one co-packaged optics assembly that works is like baking a perfect loaf of bread in your kitchen. The recipe is sound, the result is real. But making 10,000 a day, all consistent, all within spec, with the grain supply coming from a partner who helped you develop the recipe over 3 years of joint testing, that is an industrial bakery. The recipe being sound does not mean you can open the bakery tomorrow. It means you have cleared the first real hurdle, and now you can see the rest of them clearly for the first time. That is exactly where China is right now on co-packaged optics. Pull back to the pattern and it becomes legible. China keeps raising its floor. The progression runs from absent to roadmap to samples. And at each transition, the meaningful gap is revealed to be one layer up. Physics was once assumed to be the barrier. Silicon photonics on mature nodes dissolved that assumption. Now the gap has moved up to yield, thermal integration, ecosystem, and the co-development relationships that take years to build. That is not a failure of the challenger. It is the shape of how this competition runs. Every time one layer of the gap closes, the layer above it becomes the new frontier. The signal worth watching over the next 12 months is specific. A named co-packaged optics customer, or a small volume qualification milestone from the Lingang base. Not a sample announcement. Those are already on the board. A named customer or a qualification lot would mean China is moving from the sample lap to the qualification lap. It would not mean parity with TSMC and Broadcom's manufacturing roadmap, but it would mean the race is real at the next level, that the split time is being followed by a second lap, not a press release. Here is my honest read. The dismissal. It's just a sample. China is nowhere on co-packaged optics. Ignores that the sample stage is the hardware phase, not the theory phase. China is past theory. The triumphalist read, China has cracked co-packaged optics. Ignores that the gap has now moved into the hardest part of any manufacturing technology. Yield at volume, thermal and mechanical integration at scale, and a customer co-development ecosystem that the leaders have been building for years. Neither read is honest. China has made the gap legible and measurable. The split is on the board. But posting a split time in a race you have not finished is not the same as crossing the line first. And in co-packaged optics, the finish line is a hyperscale customer placing its first production order. China has raised its floor into the hardware phase. The ceiling the leaders hold has shifted. It is no longer the physics, it is the manufacturing floor. And that is a harder ceiling to close than any bench result. That is the shape of the race as it actually stands. Here is where I want your read. In a race where China can post samples but the leaders hold the volume ramp, does the sample stage matter strategically, or does the race only count when you can ship? Is China proving it can compete for the next generation of artificial intelligence infrastructure supply chains, or is it still several real milestones behind the one that counts? I want your honest answer in the comments, and I want to know which side you come down on and why. If you want to follow the moment a co-packaged optics sample becomes a shipment, and understand what it means for artificial intelligence hardware supply chains when it does, subscribe. That is exactly what this channel tracks. A factory in Shanghai is sending light through a chip package. The split is on the board. The question is whether that lap becomes a race.